Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I'm Lynn Weil, the Director of External Affairs for CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, we'll discuss the incentives, talent development, and regulatory measures necessary to attract leading-edge chip manufacturing to the United States. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and you experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator. John Verwey is an East Asia National Security Advisor at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, or PNNL. In this role, he uses his background in strategic trade controls and US-China technology assessments to support US government export control, supply chain security, and non-proliferation missions. He also serves as a consultant to CSET. Before joining PNNL, he worked for the US Trade Representative, the US International Trade Commission, and the US Department of Commerce. John, over to you.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Well, I am going to start by thanking everyone for attending today and immediately introduce our speaker and the only panelist, Will Hunt. So Will Hunt is a research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where he leads the Institute's research on semiconductor workforce and supply chain issues. Will has previously testified for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence's STAR subcommittee, authored commentary for the Wall Street Journal, and has been quoted in the New York Times, MIT Technology Review, Wired, Axios, and the Washington Post, among others. Previously, Will was a policy researcher at Oxford and at the AI Security Initiative at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. He also has attended Yale, has a master's from UC Berkeley, and is currently completing a PhD there while concurrently working at CSET. So with that, Will, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, John. And many thanks to Lynn and to the CSET External Affairs team for setting all this up. And thanks to all of you for joining. And yeah, really excited to be talking about semiconductors, my favorite subject. Yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. So here is where we are headed. We have a fair amount of ground to cover, but I'll just try to keep this to about 20-ish minutes. And I'm going to be presenting findings here from 4 CSET papers, 2 of them by me, one by Remco Zwetsloot and myself, and then the final one by John, our moderator. And the central focus of these papers is really on how to strengthen and sustain US competitiveness in chip making, particularly as we face rising competition in East Asia. Next slide, please. Thank you. So bottom line up front, passing the CHIPS Act is absolutely essential, but it's only a first step. So the subsequent steps, first we need to make sure that the chips manufacturing incentives actually target the kinds of capacity that we most need. So there are many different types of chips where US and allied capacity actually looks pretty healthy, as we'll discuss. But there are certain types of chips for which we have zero onshore capacity, and unfortunately, virtually all the world's existing capacity is in just one to 3 countries in East Asia. So that's number one, is just make sure that chips incentives are going to the right places. And then we also need to complement reshoring of chip making capacity itself with other policies such as workforce development, high-skilled immigration reform, and streamlining fab permitting processes. So CSET's got papers on all of these issues, and these policies will help ensure that CHIPS funding actually succeeds in its aims. We can't really just build fabs. We have to build an entire ecosystem and strengthen an entire ecosystem. And so that's a core theme of this presentation. Next slide, please. So the need for chips. Let's start with just talking about chip making capacity itself. I want to be clear that I'm talking in this the next few minutes about the $40 billion in manufacturing incentives from the CHIPS Act, not the R&D component of the CHIPS Act. That's also valuable, but that's sort of out of scope. It's probably clear to this audience that very large swaths of the global economy depend on consistent access to semiconductors. And unfortunately, while the US is dominant in some parts of the semiconductor supply chain, East Asia has become the center, really, of chip manufacturing itself. The clearest way to illustrate just how dependent we are on East Asia is to think about a hypothetical. If we imagine that China invades Taiwan, which unfortunately is not as unlikely as I would like it to be over the next decade, and we imagine the impacts that might have, we would lose access to, if we lost access to chips coming from Taiwan and China, we would lose 85% of all leading edge microprocessors in the world, almost 2/3 of more mature microprocessors, and also half of all DRAM chips. So the economic and security implications here are fairly worrisome. The US would be simultaneously facing a major foreign policy crisis, shortages in those chips and all of the technologies that require them, which include key military equipment as well as critical US infrastructure. And we'd also be facing very likely an economic crisis, which would be much more severe than the turmoil resulting from the recent semiconductor shortages. Next slide, please. And actually, you can skip this slide just for purposes of time. Thanks. So we'd like the U.S. to be a place where the knowledge and engineering know-how related to chip making accumulates, and we'd like to really be the center of gravity of chip making in the world. But the difficult thing is that that center of gravity currently is in South Korea and Taiwan, and it's become very expensive to shift it over time. So this chart shows that the costs of building fabs is growing by roughly 11% per year. So if you want to make the United States, more the center of gravity of advanced chip manufacturing, it may actually be too expensive to do that by even 2030. At that point, a single fab could cost $50 billion. Congress may just be unwilling to spend the amount of money required at that point. Next slide, please. So Congress, fortunately, is prepared to fund the CHIPS Act. They're acting at the right time. I think, sooner the better from my perspective in terms of funding the CHIPS Act. But once that funding passes, we have another challenge, which is then deciding how to actually spend the money. And there are a lot of different types of chips here. So what is the highest priority? The table that you're looking at is pretty complex, but the basic idea is to break down this question into different sub-questions. So if something is in red here, that means it's comparatively higher priority for reshoring. And leading edge logic and DRAM chips are the ones where you see red all across the top there. We basically have no onshore capacity. They go into lots of sensitive applications, and global capacity is concentrated in either one country that is at risk of disruptions or a small number of countries where the risk is correlated. So for example, if China invades Taiwan, that's a correlated risk. You might lose access to chips from both China and Taiwan. Leading edge logic foundry capacity looks especially dire here. So we have zero capacity. 85% of global capacity is in Taiwan and would be at risk. Next slide, please. So here are some recommendations from my report on this question of how to spend the CHIPS funding. Basically, I'd like to see the bulk of funding go towards leading edge logic, with DRAM as a secondary priority, and then legacy logic as a third priority. And you can see roughly how that would translate into fabs and wafer capacity in the table there. I guess, yeah, next slide, please. And then we can get even more specific here with the leading edge logic incentives. And again, I'd say this is really a minimum of what you'd want to invest in leading edge logic. And ideally, you could get commitments to build more than this amount. But as a baseline, I think we want to incentivize one new fab from each of Intel and Samsung, and then at least 2 fabs from TSMC. And the reasoning here is just this just reflects at least my assessment of the current distribution of U.S. demand for leading edge logic chips in the U.S. right now. It's worth noting that these companies' capacity does not substitute. So, for example, TSMC, the Taiwanese chip maker, can't actually make an Intel CPU at the moment, and Intel can't make a 5 nanometer TSMC chip. So you do, unfortunately, or fortunately, or however you want to put it, you do need a diversity of chip makers when it comes to logic, and not just one. And that's a little different from areas like memory, which are more commodity chips, and they're a little bit more interchangeable. With logic, we do need this diversity of different sourcing options depending on the technology that we need chips for. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations, beyond just where to target funding, there are also steps we need to do to ideally reduce the need for incentives going forward. So I'll just highlight a couple points here. First of all, we need to better understand the level of incentives that are already being offered by South Korea and Taiwan. It turns out, and this was a bit of a challenge for writing this report that I wrote, it turns out there's no definitive assessment of how much funding South Korea and Taiwan are offering their chip makers at the moment. The estimates that are out there are disputed by industry, and it's pretty important to understand this. To understand, first of all, how much in terms of subsidies should we offer in order to level the playing field. And then secondly, if you ever want to negotiate subsidies downward, you have to start from a point of actually understanding where they're at the moment. So the other piece here as well is that we should really ideally be coordinating with allies to focus on different kinds of chip investments. So for example, Japan has struggled to attract leading edge logic capacity from TSMC, but Japan is actually pretty good at producing other types of chips, especially like things like legacy logic chips. So ideally, you could have countries like Japan, which might not make sense to specialize so much at the leading edge, as well as countries in Europe who are in a similar position, but which are very good at other kinds of chips, actually investing in those areas, and the US investing more at the leading edge, and then making sure that in the event of a crisis, we can all support each other, rather than trying to end up in some kind of sort of subsidy race to the bottom with our allies. That seems rather counterproductive. The goal here is really to diversify supply away from especially sensitive places, in particular Taiwan and China. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's assume that we've spent the CHIPS funding in a targeted way. We focused on leading edge logic, DRAM, and then maybe thirdly on legacy logic. I also did some analysis to try to figure out, if we spent the money in roughly that way, how many workers would we need to staff the fabs, the chip making facilities that would be built, and what are the particular occupations that we would need to find workers for. So this is based on combining projections from the BLS. So they have sort of projections for different occupations within the semiconductor industry of how much they would grow under a status quo scenario. And then we add on the number that I project you would need to staff these new fabs that would be built with the CHIPS Act funding. And the result is we can see quite significant growth in engineering and software developer roles. So these kind of high-skilled technical roles over the next decade, about 19% over that time, and then somewhat slower growth in other occupations that are somewhat lower skilled or just, not as focused on engineering. Next slide, please. Now, so here's the problem. This graph shows the number of foreign-born workers versus US students in semiconductor relevant graduate programs in the US. And you can see that we have a good number of foreign-born workers who could do these jobs, but the number of American workers with the required educational background especially for these high-skilled engineering roles that we're talking about here, has been unfortunately pretty much flat for 3 decades since 1990. So, we definitely need to change that. And a lot of the need here is for investments in workforce development, which I'll get into later. Next slide, please. The good news is that we do, in fact, have the US is a massive importer of international semiconductor engineering talent. So this is a graph of electrical engineering patent holders who immigrated either to or from different countries. And you can see that the US stands out by, it dominates other countries in terms of how much it benefits. Whereas countries like China and India are basically experiencing pretty significant brain drain. Um, and semiconductor firms really rely on this talent. And it's one of the things that draws companies to want to build in the US is the prospect of being able to draw on US engineering talent. One of the best things that we can do to capitalize on this is just to make sure that these workers have a long-term pathway to citizenship. So they don't just work at US companies and then get trained up and then have to leave and help companies abroad. It would be good if they can just stay in the United States for the longer term. Next slide, please. And there's more good news, which is that these foreign-born workers who are higher skilled tend to want to stay in the United States if they possibly can. So we can see here in the data this is data from NSF, and we're looking at PhD holders in semiconductor relevant fields who are not American-born, and especially the ones from China and India, but really everyone would like to stay in the United States if possible at pretty high rates. Next slide, please. So then the question is, how many of these foreign-born workers will we actually need to staff new fabs made by CHIPS Act incentives? And my estimate here is roughly 3,500 workers. These are mostly high-skilled engineering workers and software development folks. And that's in addition to however many would already have immigrated by default. So it is a significant increase over a status quo scenario, but it's also pretty doable. We're not talking about, open borders. We're talking about really a targeted intervention capturing a very critical slice of global engineering talent, just to make sure that CHIPS Act incentives are successful. Next slide, please. Okay, so to sum up our workforce recommendations here, we're basically talking about the usual suspects really. In the long term, we want to increase the number of American workers who have the background required to do these, especially these high-end engineering jobs. That could mean scholarships and on-the-job training associated with semiconductor relevant graduate programs. Basically one of the goals here is actually just to persuade tech-inclined undergrads to study things like material science and electrical engineering, and hopefully even go to grad school, when otherwise, the easy option for many STEMmy undergrads is just to do a software engineering degree and then go and work for a Google or some software company. So making it easy for folks who are interested in things like electrical engineering and semiconductor engineering to maybe do a couple extra years of schooling in order to get these really good jobs in the semiconductor industry. Then the other piece, of course, is retaining and strengthening immigration pathways. So things like eliminating country-based caps on green cards. And you could focus on only workers, again, who are planning to work in national security relevant industries, like the semiconductor industry. You could also narrow it to only focus on those who have a master's or a PhD. Especially master's students are really important for the semiconductor industry. And then the final thing I wanted to highlight here is it would be great to have better data so that we can know whether we're succeeding or not in these policies. So for example, if the NSF collected more detailed survey data on master's students and not just on PhDs, that would be very helpful for doing this kind of analysis. master students right now are, yeah, as I said, they're very important, but they don't get as much attention in these surveys. Next slide, please. All right, finally, I wanted to briefly touch on some really excellent work done by John, our moderator, on streamlining regulatory processes associated with fab permitting. So one key finding from John's paper is that the US not only builds fewer fabs than other countries right now, it also takes longer to build a fab from start to finish in the United States. And one reason for that is regulatory obstacles. So a big obstacle, which is worth highlighting here, is NEPA review. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. And NEPA reviews average 4.5 years from start to finish. And that doesn't include the 2 or so years that it takes to physically construct a fab. So that's, I mean, you could actually end up being 2 or 3 generations behind the leading edge in the semiconductor industry if you have to wait for that long in order to actually start constructing the manufacturing facilities created by the CHIPS Act. So making sure to streamline that process and other regulatory obstacles is really important. And John's paper is an excellent resource for that. Another thing to look at is that John highlights are the recommendations on environmental review and permitting from the 2017 PCAST report on ensuring long-term US leadership in semiconductors. That report just has a bunch of recommendations that we endorse and are excited about. And then finally, there are certain types of production and refining capacity, which are inputs to chip making, that face very serious obstacles to construction in the United States at this point, just because of regulations. So in some cases, it's actually probably better to just coordinate with allies and assure that we have access to those inputs from overseas rather than trying to build in the US, just because the regulatory hurdles are so high. Next slide, please. All right, so back to the bottom line. There's a lot more I could say, but just to leave time for questions, I'm going to reiterate passing the CHIPS Act is absolutely essential, but only a first step. The second step is to carefully target incentives at the right types of chips, which are most urgently in need of reshoring. Some are much more urgent than others. And alongside that, there are many other policies needed to make sure reshoring is actually successful in the long run. And those include workforce development, high-skilled immigration reform, and streamlining fab permitting processes. It's really it's an all of the above approach that's needed here, because again, the goal is to actually shift the center of gravity of chip making back to the United States. And you also have to shift the associated ecosystem of firms and talent all back home. So the CHIPS Act has huge potential to do that, but the United States has to take further steps to capitalize on that potential. Next slide. This is just to give you some pointers to, first of all, the papers that I've been discussing here, and also say it would be great if you could sign up for our mailing list and our newsletter if you're not already on it. We do have a couple great papers in the pipeline right now. For example, John, I know, is working on a couple papers on reshoring advanced packaging, which I'm really excited about. So please do stay in touch, keep following CSET's work, and please give us feedback, because it's really for folks like all of you on the call. So thank you very much, and looking forward to chatting with you, John.
Thank you, Will. As John comes back to join us, I just wanted to say it's time to open things up for questions from our attendees. While those are coming in, John gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A himself. In the meantime, if anyone wants to ask a question, please type it in the chat and it will be read aloud. Those who are phoning in for this meeting won't be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations. We'll try to get to all the questions that we do receive. John, back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. So actually, there are lots of good questions already coming in. I would again encourage folks to send more, but I'm going to start with an observation that was in the chat and use that to get the conversation started. One of the commenters observed, Will, that I'm going to paraphrase this slightly, but they said, "I'm surprised that Micron's 20% DRAM market share isn't factored in and emphasized more. Why not increase existing capacity rather than reshore overseas capacity?" And I know you and I have talked about this before, but I want to give you a chance to explain where the emphasis is and why it is there.
Yeah, it's a great question about Micron specifically. So the short answer is Micron's capacity, unfortunately, is just not mostly in the US. Even though it's a US company, it's headquartered in the US, its capacity is not here. So the concern, of course, is in the case of a major disruption in East Asia, it doesn't actually help us if the company is headquartered in the United States, if they're not actually making chips in the United States. I would say that's the shortest possible answer to the Micron thought.
Yeah, that I know you ran the numbers on that at one point, and in your most recent paper, you backed that out, I think, for Intel, Micron, and maybe Analog Devices to see how much of their capacity is in the US versus overseas. So moving on to another question, I wanted to pull the thread a bit on legacy chips. So you talked a bit about the importance of reshoring leading edge logic and DRAM in particular, but I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on the importance of legacy or non-leading edge chips and maybe tie into your response how that might align with the idea you proposed for international coordination with Japan. I could see a scenario where perhaps Japanese chip makers focus on legacy chips for the auto industry or something like that. Could you elaborate a little bit there?
Yeah, I think that's basically the way I'm thinking about it. That um, a lot of there are countries in Europe, and then there's Japan that have really good strengths already in legacy chips, and helping allowing them to double down on that strength, and then making sure that we all have access to each other's chips seems quite valuable. I do think that there are specific legacy chips um, that we do need onshore in the United States. And that's where I think it makes sense to spend some fraction of the CHIPS Act funding. Particularly, I think, because legacy capacity, you remember that graph of the exponentially rising costs of fabs. So the nice thing is legacy chips just cost less. It costs less to build a fab. So you can get a lot of bang for your buck with actually a fairly modest portion of the CHIPS Act funding. So I don't know if that answers your question, but basically, definitely think it's worth investing somewhat in legacy chips, but you have to. The U.S. actually has some capacity at the legacy nodes, especially via global foundries. So making sure we have what we need to supply, especially defense applications, but focusing probably mostly on the leading edge makes sense to me.
Great, thanks for that. One other question from the chat here is kind of a high level question that fits in a little bit with the legacy conversation. How can we attract chip makers when you have China offering very lucrative deals to Taiwanese chip makers in particular? I think maybe in your response, Will, I might nudge you also to talk about China's investments to attract legacy chip makers and what that means for our efforts to reshore legacy manufacturing as well.
Yeah, this is a whole area that I would have liked to have gotten into in the presentation. So yeah, in short, China is in fact spending tens of billions. Some have argued even hundreds of billions of dollars on basically trying to build up their domestic chip making capacity. A lot of that is focused on. So far, they've had a lot of trouble getting anyone to build more leading edge chip capacity in China. Part of the reason is that there are export controls on some of the equipment that's required for making leading edge chips. Then the question was about countering China's incentives. So the good thing is that because of existing export controls and China's difficulty entering the leading edge, we don't need to counter China at the leading edge at the moment. But in terms of in terms of countering legacy subsidies, I think this is a real concern. Um, I suppose I would say it currently still appears that legacy chip makers like Global Foundries are happy to build more in the U.S. And supply is just more diversified in general. Like there's quite a bit of capacity in Europe and in Japan. So are incentives needed at the legacy level? Perhaps, but I still worry most about countering about leveling the playing field with Taiwan and South Korea, and actually a little bit less about leveling it with China, despite the vastness of the incentives that they're offering.
Got it. Thank you. One other question from the chat that's kind of related to this as well is someone asks, the current CHIPS Act stipulates that funding allocation will only last for 5 years. Is that a sufficient time period? And if it is not, how can we ensure that we can get additional funds if they're needed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say there's potential that it's not a sufficiently large or long timeline, especially depending on how long these regulatory processes take to overcome. Yeah, I am a little bit concerned about this. I think in terms of what to do about that, I would say, I think we can make some of these investments now and then hopefully get the ball rolling on projects before that time period elapses. But yeah, in terms of re-upping on CHIPS incentives 5 years down the road, I hope that the CHIPS Act funding will engender a bit of a trajectory shift for the United States. I actually skipped my slide about this, but I think there's real potential for funding now to kind of have ripple effects over the long run. So, but if we are in a position where we need to add more incentives in the future, I don't know. I think that's kind of a conversation. That's another conversation. I think we have to make our best effort with what we have now, and we're in a position to do a lot in the next 5 years. But yeah, I guess I wouldn't want to rule out the possibility that we would need to make future investments.
So thinking of the theme of future investments and kind of what is not explicitly in the CHIPS Act, there were also a few questions about the supply chain and specific vulnerabilities that are not necessarily called out in the CHIPS Act, but that could theoretically be resolved. And one commenter noted neon prices spiking after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 due to the high concentration of neon production in Ukraine at that time, and also the intensive nature by which it's consumed in the chip industry. And then I saw another commenter mentioned IC substrates as a particularly acute vulnerability. I think the CHIPS Act gets at that problem in general, but not specifically. If there were a CHIPS Act 2.0, could you elaborate a little bit on what you think is missing from the current one and how that might fit into these sorts of supply chain conversations?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So on IC substrates, I know, John, you have your paper coming out, which actually touches on the importance of IC substrates in particular. I think that's a really key area. With that said, I think, and actually advanced packaging more broadly is something that I didn't talk too much about in my presentation, but I think absolutely deserves some portion of funding. I actually think, though, the CHIPS Act 1.0 is pretty good. It's like it does give quite a bit of leeway to focus on some of the gaps, the most important vulnerabilities. And I do think that, when you look across the supply chain, there are not very many areas where there are single points of failure in countries like Taiwan that face such serious risks. Like there's, photolithography equipment is absolutely essential to chip making, but it's, it's all in most of it's in the Netherlands, and then also to some degree in Japan. And those are they just face much lower risks of interruptions. So anyway, I guess this is all to say, I take these risks seriously. I think there is some flexibility in CHIPS Act funding to target some of these areas. but I'm pretty happy with CHIPS Act 1.0.
Yeah, and I know you and I have talked about this offline, but there is an interesting trend that these leading edge fabs seem to exert kind of a gravitational pull over their supply chain. And so by increasing leading edge fabrication capacity, you end up having follow-on effects where their suppliers to those facilities co-locate or end up coming nearby. And we're seeing that in Arizona with chemical suppliers from Taiwan coming in following TSMC's lead.
Yeah, I do think there's these fabs, because they are such a huge capital expenditure, and then also because they're just the place where all of the different parts of the supply chain come together. They have this kind of center of gravity effect that ripples outward for sure.
I wanted to return to some questions in the chat and also focus a little bit on the workforce side of your presentation for a minute. So we had two questions related to workforce, one of which focused on workforce training. Basically, how effective is workforce training at getting the workforce the chip industry needs? And then a second question that was focused more on workforce retention, the fact that frequently working in a fab, physically working in a fab, is not the most glamorous or desirable place to be. And if you are a well-educated STEM grad or PhD holder, you presumably have other career options that might give you more access to things like natural light. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice and what your research found?
Yes. Yeah. So in terms of whether training works, I have to say so this is something I'd love to study more, is what are the workforce interventions that are actually best bang for your buck in terms of developing a domestic workforce. Um, I personally take somewhat of a view that actually one of the best things you can do is just build the fabs themselves, and then the chip makers start to actually, a company like Intel, for example, is now investing in Ohio and making the kinds of investments that it actually needs to make in order to build up a domestic workforce. And I think often the companies themselves are going to know better how to do that effectively than the U.S. government will. Um, with that said, yes, I think training does work. I think on-the-job training is really valuable. I think co-op models, or things like, if you can, for example, incentivize or make it easier for universities to afford fab equipment, which is very expensive. Just having that available to students then opens up a whole bunch of possibilities for actual practical training and getting students excited about these things. That if you don't have that possibility and you're not near a fab, um, it's sort of hard to imagine a student getting excited about chip making if they don't have access to the tools they need. Then the other thing on retention, and this is kind of on a similar theme. I think this is absolutely an obstacle, especially these brand name companies like Facebook and Google just have a kind of sex appeal for sure. I do think though that we underrate the degree to which sex appeal is in fact just a matter of how high the price is, like how high the wages. Like if you can pay a worker well, then you will become a more attractive company for US workers. Someone just commented, I think Intel has sex appeal. I agree. Yeah, absolutely. But I do think it's hard when you're competing with a Google, for example. So one thing that I'm excited about is CHIPS Act funding, just creating more demand for workers in the US, and then that driving up prices and making it just a more appealing thing to work on. I wonder whether also just the degree to which semiconductors have been in the news over the last couple of years will start to have an effect on this, but that's sort of speculation.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if there's going to be a motivating factor as the post-CMOS world becomes more well-defined and people see what the future looks like and the future that they frankly could participate in building. I think that might be another driver. Great comments. Lots of questions to get to. So I'm going to tie two together here that relate more to strategic thinking and international engagement. One of them asks, how does the policies that you proposed in your presentation tie into the overall Quad self-sufficiency efforts that have been discussed? And second, let me see where that went. Oh, when considering cooperation with international allies and partners, do you see more value in comprehensive multilateral agreements or simpler bilateral, plurilateral agreements that affect the chip industry?
Great questions. So in terms of the Quad, I've gotten this question a fair amount. The most obvious member of the Quad that really is essential to the semiconductor ecosystem is Japan. And then Australia and India are frankly a little bit less critical. I think there's potential for collaboration on perhaps immigration issues where maybe you could have some kind of agreement that allowed talent to flow more easily back and forth between these countries. But I don't know honestly whether the Quad is actually it's not the forum that I first think of when I think about what to do in terms of working with allies on chips related issues. I'd be curious. You can push back on that, John, if that's if you want to. But then the other thing you mentioned was about plurilateral maybe versus existing regimes for governing things like export controls. Was that the
Yeah, or multilateral regimes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I'm pretty bullish on not going through Wassenaar and establishing still regularized and multilateral coordinated efforts, especially around export controls. But the reality is that you don't need to work with that many countries in the chip industry in order to pull off really effective export controls. So even if you could get Japan, the Netherlands, Taiwan, South Korea, that would already be a lot of the, and the US, that would be a lot of the battle right there. So yeah, I don't know if that does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. And on the subject of export controls, another question posed in the chat was, would the expansion of the foreign direct product rule and the entity list harm broad progress related to chip development?
Yeah, I don't know if this is referring specifically to the recent developments with Ukraine, but I am somewhat. I think there are two. There's sort of a positive and a negative side of the recent expansion of the FDPR. On the positive side, now all of our allies have had to figure out how to work with something like an FDPR mechanism, and it's sort of accelerated, and Kevin Wolf has talked about this. It's kind of accelerated a bunch of progress towards multilateral arrangements on export controls that I think would have taken a number of years otherwise. So that's on the plus side. On the negative side, I do worry about the uncertainty that this creates. The idea that in particular the U.S. would that if you can design out U.S. components or equipment, that you should, because it's a genuine risk to your business. I do worry about that. I think with Russia, because it's a relatively small part of the global market, I'm a little less worried about it. But I think we have to use the FDPR very judiciously is the the kind of boring but probably true answer to this question. And it is something that if you overuse it, I would expect it to become less effective over time.
Do you think there's some other questions related to supply chain and specifically parts of the supply chain that don't have anything to do with leading edge logic or DRAM? Do you think the CHIPS Act is appropriately targeted to sort of these foundational parts of the supply chain, the raw materials, the substrates we've already talked about, the manufacturing equipment, all of which are kind of implicit in and within the scope of the CHIPS Act, but not explicitly called out for support. Should there be more explicit call outs to support those building blocks of this competitive ecosystem?
I guess my view here is actually that having spoken with some folks in who are just working in the executive branch right now, who will be working on figuring out what to do about the incentives. I want to give I think they're really good people and they know what they're doing, and I sort of want to give them more free reign rather than creating a bunch of stipulations about, you know, X amount of CHIPS funding needs to go to this type of capacity. So I think that's probably where I land, is just thinking that probably the right folks to, it's a really hard problem. I've done a very high level breakdown of what the priorities are, but yeah, it's a difficult problem, and I probably wouldn't want to tie commerce's hands on where they actually spend the money.
One related thought that occurred to me as you were answering that is, I've seen some criticism about the emphasis on reshoring manufacturing and the lack of emphasis on reshoring assembly, test, and packaging, because you can reshore all the chip manufacturing in the world, but if the assembly, test, and packaging capacity is still based in Asia, you still have to dice those chips, test them, and package them in Asia before putting them on a printed circuit board, which is also made in Asia.
Right.
So how broad of a supply chain reshoring effort is really possible here beyond the fabrication side? And to what extent do you think the CHIPS Act really gets at that broader problem?
Yeah, I think there is real potential for the CHIPS Act funding to address some of these, especially like these advanced packaging gaps. And I think your paper is just going to be like the best resource on that in the public domain. Um, uh, no pressure.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess I would say I do think it's potentially within scope and valuable, but I don't think that. I think the list of areas that we need to focus on is not like incredibly long beyond you know, a lot of money going towards leading edge logic, and then some chunk going towards DRAM, and then some towards legacy. You know, there are a few things we need to add on there, especially when it comes to advanced packaging. But I also, I think the asks there are just going to be less expensive. So, you know, for example, a lot of advanced packaging, it's basically like you're building a legacy fab. And that's just less expensive than these leading edge chips. So I guess maybe I feel like I'm repeating myself a bit, but just saying the leading edge fabs are the things that are going to absorb a large chunk of the funding, and I think that's appropriate. And there is enough latitude to also make sure we get these other key pieces of the supply chain, but there are not that many of those.
Yeah. One other question related to that has more to do with how the government can or cannot help, which is, in addition to the CHIPS Act, what can other government agencies like USTR and Commerce do to bolster the chip supply chain in the US? And I think I might add onto that, can they do anything to bolster the chip supply chain in the US in the short term?
Yeah, I'm I think the big thing that you have to do is the CHIPS Act funding. It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard. I think the maybe one thing I'll call out here that just occurs to me is thinking, and this goes back to a question we had earlier about China and China's investments. I do think that there's potential to use export controls to limit the access of certain companies in China to particularly equipment used for memory chip making. So like YMTC, for example, in China. These are companies that are so heavily subsidized, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of willingness to reduce those subsidies on China's part. So I think there's an argument to be made for doing more than we're already doing in terms of export controls to basically prevent those companies from flooding the market with very underpriced memory chips. And I think that something along those lines does have effects on U.S. competitiveness. If Micron is building memory fabs in the DRAM fabs in the United States, they are going to be competing with Chinese chip makers. So making sure that they're on a level playing field and not, trying to overcome huge subsidies makes a lot of sense to me.
On the subject of China, there was another question that I thought would make for some interesting back and forth. Do you think that limiting semiconductor exports to China, especially advanced semiconductors, would help slow down the progress of China's semiconductor industry?
This is a tricky one. I would say I'm still more of a fan of working further upstream in the supply chain rather than focusing so much on the chips themselves. I worry that when you do export controls on the chips themselves, you're really China's already galvanized, but you are further galvanizing China to invest even more than they already are in chip making. And you're potentially creating domestic Chinese demand for chips that are not export controlled, which Chinese chip makers might be able to provide. So I'm more optimistic about shaping China's ability to indigenize chip making capacities, and not so much usually just holding export controls on the chips themselves as a kind of last resort for, if the chips are going to the PLA, then they should not be going to the PLA. But if the chips are going to a Chinese consumer, I would say that should be allowed. And very broad export controls on the chips themselves right now, unless they're accomplishing a very targeted strategic purpose, I have some suspicions about.
Thinking more about the size and value of the incentives that are being proposed under the CHIPS Act, there have been some comments about why we are giving this large amount of money to already wealthy firms. So rather than regurgitate some of the questions, I'll just put more of a fine point on it. I think there's been quite a bit of criticism about giving wealthy firms more money, especially taxpayer dollars. And I think the way I'd put the question is, why should US taxpayer dollars be given to wealthy US headquartered and non-US headquartered firms, many of whom are already beginning to construct fabs in the United States and will be well along by the time this bill has gotten fully funded? Could you respond to some of that?
Yeah. So Intel in particular, I would say, is on a bit of a spending spree right now, which I'm very excited about. And Intel, you could say, well, oh, they're already investing in the US, but they're receiving subsidies from Ohio, and they're probably expecting subsidies from the CHIPS Act. So the idea that this is totally decoupled from the announcement of CHIPS Act funding seems a little implausible to me, though it's pretty difficult to suss out the causality there. I think it's basically up to Commerce to decide whether a project would or would not happen in the absence of incentives. And I do think if counterfactually the project would have happened no matter what, then you don't give incentives to that company. The other thing I'll note just about Intel, maybe I'm harping a little bit on Intel here, but Intel's strategy is pretty ambitious. And yeah, I don't see the same level of investment from companies like TSMC and Samsung at the moment. So making sure that those companies are investing in the US seems really important to me. You obviously don't want to give more incentives than are necessary to level the playing field and make sure that these companies are building here rather than elsewhere. But yeah, ultimately it's, yes, these are rich companies, but there are national security and economic security reasons for making sure that we have chips onshore. I think those, yeah, it's, if we have to give money to companies that are already wealthy, I think that's totally a worthwhile price to pay for to accomplish those ends.
Great. I think I'll maybe go just a little bit past the hour, maybe to no later than 5:05, but we have one or two more questions that I think are definitely worth getting to. One of which relates to R&D and the NSTC, so the National Semiconductor Technology Center that is contained within the CHIPS Act. And the question relates to how the NSTC should interoperate with other provisions within the CHIPS Act. So the Defense Department gets a couple $2 billion to fund its priorities. There's an advanced packaging program. Could you talk a little bit about how it would be optimal for those programs to relate to each other or interface?
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer here is they should be like, it should be like a hand in glove relationship, basically. Like, there's a huge need for coordination of all of these programs. And again, like, and maybe this is somewhat generic, but you know, we're building an ecosystem that needs to be sort of self-reinforcing, and all of these components are important. So I don't know. I guess that's my very high level view, is just that integrating all of these different programs and making sure that there's lots of communication and coordination is especially important in the case of the CHIPS Act, even more than we would say that it was for other kinds of programs.
Great. One other question that actually just came in, I'm going to ask because it's kind of my hobby horse right now. Does the CHIPS Act fund startups that have the potential to revolutionize any part of the semiconductor supply chain? If not, why?
That's a great question. So not that, I would say not the manufacturing incentives, which is, that's roughly 40 billion-ish of the CHIPS Act, is not targeting, you know, startups. It's targeting established companies. There are R&D incentives within the CHIPS Act, pretty significant ones, and so I would say it is actually possible in those cases that startups could get funding from the CHIPS Act. But yeah, in terms of why this is less of a focus of CHIPS Act funding, I guess here I would say probably the simplest answer is just that chip fabs are really expensive and we really need them. And so it makes sense for a very large proportion of CHIPS Act funding to be targeting the fabs rather than and these very large established companies. Maybe the other thing I can say here is that it's valuable to have a really strong startup ecosystem in the US. We do, in fact, have a strong startup ecosystem in the US. There are a lot of chip startups in the US. And the reality is that the very established players then tend to acquire the smaller players. And then, you know, that ultimately what we want is to make sure that the chips themselves are being made in the US. And I guess that would be where my focus would be when I'm thinking about this from a national security perspective, is 10 years from now, are the chips getting made here or are they getting made elsewhere? And I mean, it's nice if a US startup is the one that finds the new innovation that propels the industry forward. But if that startup is then acquired by Samsung and, you know, all of that knowledge is then moved over to South Korea, then I'm not sure where exactly that gets us.
Yeah, there was a case of a tin oxide photoresist manufacturer based in Corvallis, Oregon. You probably remember from last year, in Priya, used in EUV tooling, and they got purchased by JSR. So they're Japanese now. Last question, and it actually was also coincidentally the last question put in our chat. So I was curious what your views are on the direction of mergers and acquisitions in the semiconductor world. Do you see there being a risk of merger reviews being weaponized as a result of these heightened geopolitical tensions, specifically over semiconductor technology?
Weaponized. Yeah, I think certainly highly politicized and highly like merger reviews are now a topic that can receive attention at the highest levels of government. In terms of where I see that going in the future, I don't know. I think Firma is in the U.S. is a great development. I think CFIUS is actually like doing a really good job of screening acquisitions at this point, making sure that allies are coordinating with the U.S. and are operating at the same level, I think is probably where we need to go next on the U.S. side. China has shown itself to be, I think they will probably be not very excited about approving mergers in the opposite direction going forward. I don't know what we can really do about that, unfortunately. I think that's just a new reality we're going to have to deal with.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that. I know we're a few minutes past the hour, but we're more or less right on schedule. So I think with that final question answered, we will call it a wrap. I will let Lynn come back and take us home.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Will, for your detailed and timely presentation, as well as the answers to many very challenging questions. We're only too sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but thanks to everyone who joined us today. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and research updates. Our next webinar will take place on April 14th. It will feature CSET's Diana Gelhaus and distinguished panelists who will discuss ways to secure the US AI workforce for tomorrow. In the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope to see you again real soon.